Alex Yala's father broke down in tears, and the sacrifices he revealed will shatter everything you assumed about her journey. Since the age of 7, this young woman surrendered dimensions of childhood that most people never consider giving up. And the man who watched every single renunciation happen, who stood beside her through each one, finally allowed the full weight of that truth to surface publicly. The composure collapsed. The proud father's carefully maintained emotional architecture crumbled in real time. And what spilled out was not a polished, inspirational narrative designed for comfortable consumption. It was raw, documented, the specific, unfiltered grief of a parent who gave his daughter to a dream before she was old enough to fully comprehend what she was surrendering, and who has spent every subsequent year watching her carry that surrender with a grace that simultaneously fills him with boundless pride and quiet, permanent heartbreak. This is not a success story dressed in sacrifice's clothing. This is what sacrifice actually looks like: unglamorous, cumulative, irreversible, told by the one person who witnessed every chapter from its earliest pages. Stay through every word, because what Alex Yala's father revealed in his most vulnerable public moment contains a truth about greatness that the highlight reels and the championship trophies and the sponsorship announcements have never once shown you. Every champion arrives with a visible story and an invisible one. The visible story belongs to the athlete, the ranking climbs, the tournament victories, the public milestones that accumulate into a career narrative legible to anyone paying attention from the outside. The invisible story belongs to the people who shared the earliest chapters, who were present before the cameras arrived, who knew the person before the symbol existed, and who carry, in their private memory, every version of the individual that public recognition has rendered inaccessible. For Alex Yala, that invisible story belongs most completely to her father. Michael Yala is not a figure who sought the spotlight that his daughter's extraordinary career eventually directed toward their family. By the accounts of people who know him well, he's a man whose natural disposition runs toward privacy, toward the particular kind of dignified reserve that finds public emotional expression uncomfortable rather than cathartic. He supported his daughter's career with total commitment across years of development that demanded enormous parental sacrifice of their own. He did it without seeking recognition for that support, without leveraging his proximity to her story for personal visibility, without positioning himself as a character in a narrative he considered entirely hers. Which is precisely why the moment he broke down, publicly, completely, in front of cameras that captured every second of his composure's dissolution, landed with the force it did. When someone who doesn't cry publicly cries publicly, the world stops. Michael Yala's background provided the specific context required to understand both his investment in his daughter's development and the particular weight of what he had witnessed across the years of that development. A man with genuine understanding of competitive achievement and its demands, he recognized in Alex, from her earliest engagement with tennis, something that parents with trained eyes occasionally identify in young children: the specific alignment between natural aptitude and competitive hunger that suggests not merely that a child enjoys an activity, but that the activity has found the person it was searching for. He recognized it at 7 years old, and the recognition, however exciting in its initial dimension, arrived accompanied by a question that every parent who has ever identified extraordinary potential in a young child eventually confronts with full seriousness. What does honoring this potential actually cost? Not financially, though the financial dimensions of developing a professional tennis player are considerable and deserving of their own examination. The deeper cost, the human cost, the categories of ordinary childhood experience that elite athletic development systematically replaces with training schedules, competitive travel, and the specific psychological pressure of carrying an exceptional identity before you are old enough to have fully constructed an ordinary one. Michael Eala understood those costs intellectually before they began accumulating. He discussed them with his wife. He discussed them in age-appropriate language with Alex herself. Though what a 7-year-old can genuinely comprehend about irreversible choices is necessarily limited by the developmental capacity available to 7-year-olds for processing long-term consequence. He made the decision to support her pursuit completely. He made it with open eyes and full awareness of what he was setting in motion, and he has lived every day since with the specific complexity of a choice whose outcomes he cannot evaluate with simple categories of right or wrong, because it produced both a champion and a collection of losses that no trophy adequately compensates. When he finally spoke about it all, when the emotional architecture he had maintained across years of public composure finally proved insufficient to contain what he had been carrying, the result was a confession of love, so complete and so complicated that everyone who witnessed it recognized something true about the human cost of greatness that sports culture consistently, systematically underreports. Because we celebrate what champions achieve, we rarely sit fully with what they surrender to achieve it, and we almost never ask the people who watched the surrendering happen what that witnessing cost them. Michael Eala just answered that question, with his tears, and the answer deserves to be heard completely. 7 years old. Hold that number for a moment before continuing. 7 years old is second grade. 7 years old is losing baby teeth and believing in magic and experiencing time with the elastic, unhurried quality that childhood provides before adult frameworks compress it into schedules and obligations and the perpetual forward pressure of competitive development. 7 years old is not an age at which human beings typically make irreversible decisions about the shape of their entire existence. It is not an age associated with sacrifice in any meaningful sense, because sacrifice requires comprehension of what you are surrendering, and 7-year-olds cannot yet comprehend what ordinary childhood contains until the developmental window for experiencing it has already begun closing. Alex picked up a tennis racket with seriousness at 7, and from that point forward, according to her father's devastating account, her relationship with ordinary childhood began an irreversible alteration. Michael Eala's voice fractured for the first time when he described what happened to her mornings. Not dramatically, not in the single rupture that signals total emotional collapse, but in the specific way that voices fracture when the words being spoken carry more weight than the architecture controlling them was designed to support. While her classmates slept through weekend mornings, Alex was on courts before sunrise. While birthday party invitations arrived and were declined because tournament schedules occupied the same calendar space, she was competing in regions far from home against opponents her peers would never know. While friendships were forming in the specific organic way that childhood proximity and shared experience produces, the kind of deep, formative connections that people carry into adult life as foundational evidence of their own belonging, she was in Majorca, in a development academy on the other side of the world, surrounded by excellence and opportunity, and the particular loneliness of being exceptional in an environment designed entirely around that exceptionalism. Michael Eala knew all of this. He knew it because he was the one managing the departure logistics, signing the forms, answering the questions from relatives and family friends who wanted to understand why a child was being sent to Spain when the Philippines contained schools and courts and everything a young person needed for a good life. He answered those questions with the confident language of a father who believed completely in his daughter's path, and he believed completely. That belief was genuine and remains genuine. The tears he eventually shed were not tears of regret about the choice, but tears of accumulated grief about what the choice cost a little girl who trusted her parents to know what was best for her before she possessed the developmental capacity to evaluate that herself. The most devastating detail he shared, the one that broke his composure beyond repair and held it broken for the remainder of the interview, was simple, almost insultingly simple given its weight. She never complained. Not once. Not across the early morning practices or the missed birthday parties or the years in a foreign country or the institutional frictions or the commercial controversies or any chapter of a journey that accumulated difficulties with the relentless consistency of a sport designed to test whether your commitment exceeds your discomfort. She never once turned to him and said, "This is too much. I want my childhood back. I want Saturday mornings and sleepovers and the ordinary texture of a life not organized around competitive excellence." She absorbed everything the path required and converted it into fuel without complaint. And her father, watching that conversion happen from the proximity of a parent who understood exactly what was being consumed, carried a grief he could not share with her, because sharing it would have meant acknowledging costs she had already paid and could not recover, which would have served no purpose except transferring his pain onto hers. So he carried it alone. For years, until the cameras found him in a moment when carrying it alone was no longer possible. And when it finally poured out of him, it carried the accumulated weight of every sunrise she sacrificed, every friendship she couldn't maintain, every ordinary experience she bypassed in service of becoming extraordinary. If you are not feeling the magnitude of that right now, sit with it a moment longer, because what Michael Eala wept for was not his daughter's suffering. It was her silence about it, her graceful, constant, heartbreaking refusal to make her sacrifices anyone else's burden. That silence, he said through tears, was the most courageous thing he had ever witnessed in his life. Distance does particular things to parental love. It does not diminish it. Anyone who has ever been separated from a child they love deeply understands that distance operates as an amplifier rather than a reducer. Every kilometer between a parent and their child converts into a specific, constant, low-frequency anxiety that never fully quiets regardless of how many reassuring phone calls arrive or how many positive reports filter back through coaches and academy staff. Michael Eala lived with that anxiety for years. When Alex departed for the Rafa Nadal Academy in Mallorca, a journey whose geographic distance from Manila requires no elaboration for anyone who has ever consulted a map of the distance between the Philippines and Spain, the family entered a new chapter whose emotional dimensions none of them had fully anticipated, despite their intellectual preparation for it. She was young. She was on the other side of the world. She was in an elite, competitive environment that demanded everything she possessed daily in a country whose language and culture and climate and food and social architecture differed from everything she had grown up surrounded by. And she was doing it without her parents in the building, without her mother's cooking in the kitchen, without her father's presence at courtside, replaced by coaches who were excellent and caring and professionally invested in her development, but they were not him. Michael Eala described the phone calls of that period with a specificity that suggested he had replayed them so many times in his private memory that their details had achieved the permanence of physical objects rather than recollections. She would tell him about her training, about the sessions that went well and the ones that revealed technical gaps she was working to address. She would describe the other academy players, the coaching staff, the facility, the Majorcan weather that differed so dramatically from Manila's tropical constancy. She would ask about home, about her mother, about her siblings, about the particular domestic details that people separated from their families anchor themselves to when ordinary proximity is unavailable. She did not tell him when she was struggling emotionally. He knew, because parents know, regardless of the physical distance between them and their children, when something is being withheld from the conversation to protect them from worry. He knew, and he could not reach through the phone and provide what proximity allows parents to provide. He could only speak, only reassure, only express through whatever words were available across thousands of kilometers of Pacific and Atlantic Ocean that his belief in her was absolute, and his love was undiminished by the distance between them. Those calls sustained her. He believes this completely. But what he only admitted publicly for the first time in his breakdown interview was that the discipline required to sound confident and supportive and forward-looking during conversations when his own anxiety was operating at maximum capacity represented one of the more demanding performances of his life. He was performing strength for her because she needed it. She was, as she eventually came to fully understand, performing contentment for him because she understood that her father's worry needed management alongside her own. Two people on opposite ends of the world, both protecting the other from the full weight of their own emotional experience, both succeeding well enough that the protection held, both carrying in the privacy of their individual silences after the calls ended everything that love had required them to withhold. Michael Eala paused in his interview at this point. A long pause, the kind that happens when a person is deciding if they have the emotional capacity to continue, or has already decided to continue and is simply gathering what is required. He continued. He said the distance taught him something about his daughter that no amount of proximity had fully revealed, that her strength was not performed, that it was not the brittle kind of apparent toughness that shatters under sufficient pressure. It was structural, load-bearing, the specific kind of resilience that forms when a person is tested repeatedly before they are fully developed and chooses each time to meet the test rather than retreat from it. He said watching her make that choice repeatedly across years of separation and difficulty and institutional resistance was the greatest privilege of his life. And then he paused again, shorter this time. And then he said it was also the hardest thing he had ever watched, because the person absorbing all of that difficulty was his little girl. The same one who had held his hand crossing streets at 7 years old, the same one who needed him to check under her bed before sleeping, the same one who trusted him completely when he told her that Mallorca was the right choice. She trusted him, she went, she paid every cost to the path required, and he has spent every day since wishing he could give her back what she paid, while understanding completely that she would refuse the refund. Because she chose this. Not at 7, when the choice was made for her with the best intentions available, but at every subsequent age, at every subsequent decision point, with the full and growing comprehension of what she was continuing to sacrifice. She chose it anyway, every time, without complaint. If that doesn't break your heart open, nothing will. The interview in which Michael Eala's composure finally, publicly dissolved was not designed as a confessional. It began as a profile, the kind of feature journalism that profiles family members of prominent athletes during periods of significant public interest in their subject. A respected Philippine sports journalist conducting a conversation with the father of the country's most celebrated active athlete during a period when Eala's name dominated global tennis conversation, asked questions designed to illuminate the human background of an extraordinary career. The early exchanges were controlled. Michael Eala had given interviews before. He understood the format, navigated the questions with practiced competence, offered the kind of proud but measured parental assessment that journalists expect and audiences receive comfortably. He spoke about her work ethic with genuine admiration. He described her competitive character with the specific authority of someone who had observed it developing across 2 decades. He credited her coaches, her support team, the facility, the Mallorcan weather that differed so dramatically from Manila's tropical constancy. He credited her coaches, her support team, the facility, the Mallorcan weather that differed so dramatically from Manila's tropical constancy. He credited her coaches, her support team, the facility, the Mallorcan weather that differed so dramatically from Manila's tropical constancy. He credited her coaches, her support team, the facility, the Mallorcan weather that differed so dramatically from Manila's tropical constancy. He credited her coaches, her support team, the facility, the Mallorcan weather that differed so dramatically from Manila's tropical constancy. He credited her coaches, her support team, the facility, the Mallorcan weather that differed so dramatically from Manila's tropical constancy. He credited her coaches, her support team, the facility, the Mallorcan weather that differed so dramatically from Manila's tropical constancy. He credited her coaches, her support team, the facility, the Mallorcan weather that differed so dramatically from Manila's tropical constancy. He credited her coaches, her support team, the facility, the Mallorcan weather that differed so dramatically from Manila's tropical constancy. He credited her coaches, her support team, the facility, the Mallorcan weather that differed so dramatically from Manila's tropical constancy. He credited her coaches, her support team, the facility, the Mallorcan weather that differed so dramatically from Manila's tropical constancy.
He credited her coaches, her support team, the facility.
His voice changed texture on the word friendships. It became the specific audible quality of a man suppressing something he has decided not to suppress any longer. He continued. He spoke about her teenage years, the social architecture of adolescence that she experienced from a distance, observing through her phone the ordinary milestones of peers whose lives were not organized around competitive schedules. Graduations she missed, family celebrations she participated in through screens rather than presence, the accumulated texture of a Filipino childhood rich with communal gathering and familial density and the specific warmth of a culture that treats togetherness as a value in itself, all of it available to her in diminished, mediated, temporally compressed form because the calendar belonged to her career. By this point in the interview, his eyes were carrying what his voice was no longer successfully concealing. The journalist, with the specific sensitivity of someone who understood they were witnessing something that deserved space rather than interruption, allowed the silence that followed to remain unbroken, and Michael Eala, father of the most celebrated Filipino athlete of his generation, allowed what had been building for years to arrive. The tears came without drama, not in the theatrical fashion of performed grief, but in the quiet, unstoppable way of genuine emotion that has been held in containment longer than containment was designed to sustain. His face did not contract. His voice did not rise. He simply sat with his composure dissolved around him and spoke through whatever remained accessible. He said he was proud. Completely, permanently, overwhelmingly proud. He said he would make the same choices again because the alternative was denying her the path that was always hers. And then he said the sentence that destroyed every person watching. He said he just wished, sometimes, that greatness didn't cost so much from the people who didn't choose it. He wasn't talking about Alex. He was talking about the child she used to be, the 7-year-old who picked up a racket and trusted the adults around her to guide her correctly, who didn't yet possess the vocabulary for sacrifice and therefore couldn't consent to it in any meaningful sense, who simply loved tennis and trusted her father and went where the path led without fully understanding that paths in one direction necessarily foreclose paths in others. That child, Michael Eala, was grieving. Not with regret. He repeated that carefully, clearly, without ambiguity. Not with regret, with love. With the specific parental grief of someone who watched their child's ordinary childhood become extraordinary destiny, and who understood that both dimensions of that transformation deserved to be honored simultaneously. The camera did not cut away. It held the moment, which was the correct editorial decision, the only humane one, the one that allowed viewers around the world to sit in the truth of what they were witnessing rather than being rescued from its discomfort. The Philippines sat with it and wept alongside him. Michael Eala's breakdown did something that years of Alex Eala's competitive achievements, commercial controversies, and institutional battles had not managed to accomplish. It made her completely human, not in diminishment, the opposite. It made her human in the specific way that reveals the full magnitude of what human beings are capable of when they commit completely to something larger than ordinary comfort. It made her human in the way that produces not just admiration, but genuine, deep, enduring reverence. Because champions, in the way that sports culture typically presents them, are allowed to be extraordinary, but not fully fragile. They are permitted triumph and visible struggle, but the deeper costs, the invisible surrenders, the developmental losses that don't appear in any statistical record, those remain private, unless a moment like Michael Eala's interview cracks the containment open. When the containment cracked, what emerged was not a diminished picture of a celebrated athlete, it was a completed one.
Alex Eala is not simply a young woman with extraordinary tennis talent who climbed a competitive ladder through work and determination. She is a person who has been paying for her greatness since before she was old enough to understand the currency being exchanged, who has been carrying the weight of national expectation, institutional resistance, commercial turbulence, and the private grief of accumulated sacrifice simultaneously, continuously, without complaint, since the age of 7. That is not a sports story. That is a human story of the rarest, most demanding, most awe-inspiring variety. The response to Michael Ayala's breakdown across the Philippines operated on frequencies that transcended sports fandom entirely. Parents contacted Philippine media to describe watching the interview with their own children, using it as the kind of conversation catalyst that important human truths sometimes provide for families who needed the words but lacked the opening. Athletes from other disciplines reached out publicly and privately to express recognition, the specific solidarity of people who understood the sacrifice dimension from their own experience and were moved to see it acknowledged with such unguarded honesty. Tennis coaches working with young developing players reported using the interview in their own conversations with families navigating the early stages of the developmental commitment that elite tennis requires, not as a warning, as a framework for honest conversation about what the path genuinely costs, so that families entering that path could do so with the full comprehension that Michael Ayala wished he had possessed with greater depth before the costs began accumulating. Alex Eala herself responded to her father's interview with a social media post that was brief enough to read in under 10 seconds and substantial enough to carry in memory permanently. She posted a photograph, not of a trophy or a court or a sponsor logo, a photograph of her father, taken years earlier at a tournament she competed in as a junior, from an angle that captured him watching her compete from courtside. His expression in the image carried everything his interview had verbalized: the pride, the anxiety, the love too large for any container available to human beings except the imperfect, leaking vessel of parental devotion. Her caption contained 4 words: "Everything because of you." 4 words. 25 years of relationship compressed into the minimum syllables required to convey the maximum truth. The post received more engagement than anything she had shared in her entire public career. Not because the number of words was impressive, because every person who read them understood without additional context exactly what they contained. And in the space between those 4 words and everything her father had wept about in his interview, the complete portrait of Alex Eala finally, fully emerged. Not the commercial phenomenon, not the institutional controversy magnet, not the ranking number or the jersey sales figure or the Nadal protege or the national symbol. The person, the daughter, the 7-year-old who picked up a racket and trusted the people who loved her and paid every cost the path demanded without ever once asking to be reimbursed. That person deserves every championship coming her way, not as reward for talent. Talent is distributed without moral dimension, as recognition for the specific, sustained, breathtaking courage of someone who has been choosing greatness over comfort since 7 years old, on courts across the world, away from home, in the face of every institutional and commercial obstacle the sport placed in her path. Her father saw all of it, carried all of it, and finally, beautifully, humanly, let the world see what carrying it looked like. The tears were not weakness. They were the most honest accounting of greatness that sports culture has witnessed in years. Tell us in the comments, did Michael Ayala's breakdown change how you see Alex Ayala's journey? And what do we owe the athletes who sacrificed their childhoods for the championships we celebrate? Subscribe right now for every story beneath the surface of women's tennis, the human truth, the invisible costs, and the complete portraits that highlights and rankings never fully capture. This channel exists exactly for these moments.